All right, well, thank you all for coming. I know that, everyone's afraid of the snow, but it's going to melt. We got a great lecture tonight. I'm really glad to have René here. And I wanted to just really quick, I wanted to start just by telling a little story. So the year was 2005. The place was Tijuana, Mexico. 2 UCLA graduate studios, one led by Bob Solmel, the other by Mark Lee, had just crossed the border at San Ysidro. They'd come to study Tijuana's architecture and urbanism. I was along for the ride as a teaching assistant in Mark's studio. Now, before long, our group had made its way through the touristy bustle near the border crossing and Avenida Revolucion and headed east, out past the airport and the maquiladoros, and up into the irregular settlements that continue to expand Tijuana's perimeter into the adjacent foothills. We studied the vibrant vitality of those neighborhoods, the clear organizational principles that governed these supposedly unplanned precincts. We sketched plans of streets and plazas and neighborhoods and tallied an array of building types. We documented the clever programmatic and tectonic innovations that made these neighborhoods work so well. We also compared our findings with equally careful study of government-planned housing that had been developed nearby. We saw that the irregular settlements seemed to outperform the planned housing in just about every way. Now, unlike so many American academic projects abroad, we didn't look at Tijuana as a problem to solve. Rather, we saw it as a rich tapestry of architectural and urban achievements to emulate. So we took our findings back to Westwood and proceeded to work up a series of projects which deployed what we learned in Tijuana on sites in Los Angeles. The studio was an unqualified success. Now, you're probably thinking that much of the credit goes to the great work of that gifted TA. And you're right, that's true. But what's also true is that the studio would not have been possible if it weren't for tonight's guest, René Peralta. So it was René who already knew everything we neophytes were just discovering. It was René that turned Bob and Mark on to the incredible architecture of Tijuana, his hometown, and it was René who met us at the border and set up the army of field guides and urban scholars with whom we worked. It was also René who made sure we found our way into and out of the settlements, and it was René who also made sure that we immersed ourselves every night into what he called the real Tijuana. It involves him playing bongos. So René is, he just knows everything about that place, and that knowledge is really why I wanted to bring him here today. A little more general background, René is the principal of Generica, an architecture and urban design studio based in Tijuana. His work, which addresses architecture, planning, and landscape equally, focuses on the contemporary and future forms of the US-Mexico border region. He trained as an architect at the New School in San Diego and at the Architectural Association in London. Last September, he was named the Herb Greene Teaching Fellow at the Gibbs College of Architecture at the University of Oklahoma. Previously, he taught at UCLA, Washington University at St. Louis, and Woodbury University in San Diego. He's the author, with Fiamma Montezemolo, I keep having to switch Italian and Spanish. It's screwing me up. With Fiamma and Heriberto Yépez of Aquí es Tijuana, a kind of guidebook to all those qualities we explored in 2005. He's also the editor with Tito, Alegría, and Roger Lewis of this commemorative edition of A Temporary Paradise, a look at the special landscape of San Diego, which was originally prepared by Kevin Lynch and Donald Appleyard. René has a very long and impressive list of accomplishments and accolades, which, if I read them all, would leave us with very little time for the lecture. So suffice it to say that René Peralta is an extremely talented architect and urbanist, a gifted teacher, a formidable scholar, and an unwavering advocate for the architectural and urban possibilities of the border region. Please help me welcome René Peralta.
Well, thank you, Todd. I hope it's not all downhill from here. I'm really honored to be here at the Knowlton School. Really, for me, it was very. I've been thinking about it since today. He sent me an email and invited me to come here. So you've been stressing me out for like a few months. But I'm really glad to be here. What I'm going to show today is a series of everything, a series of projects, the things we do down there as a firm, and the things we've done with students from Woodbury University, from Washington University in St. Louis, etc. So it's also the 20 years since I founded Generica. So I'm not going to show 20 years of stuff, but I think there's going to be stuff from the past just to let you know how we have evolved or not. I know it's up to you. But what the work has been about, and what is it to actually, practice at the border region, specifically on the south side. This picture is of the border. This is of course, in the Pacific Ocean. This picture was taken from the north side, so I decided it was appropriate because now I'm studying the border from the United States, not from Tijuana, for the first time in my life. So it's the view, kind of a more critical view of kind of what we've done, how does it look? A change of it's like the title. It's a parallax. It's a different way to look at things as they change. Also, this is kind of I chose Jorge Luis Borges, this Argentinian writer, as a disclaimer. I have no way of knowing whether the events that I'm about to narrate are effects or causes. So I mean that can explain a little bit of what I'm doing. What are we going to see today? In all of this work and things that we do, that we've done, from art, working with artists, we've done, of course, the traditional buildings with clients, but also work with governments, academic. There's always some kind of basic conceptual framework for the work. And it has to do with kind of the contemporary view of what the border means, what the border is today. Of course, it's always changing, especially in the climate that we are today. But one of the two major, let's say, ideologies or conceptual ideas, one is from Michael Deere, who's a geographer from Berkeley, and a good friend, and Gustavo Leclerc, who Todd, I think, knows. Leclerc also studied at UCLA, who's an architect from LA. Leclerc is much more Chicano kind of architect, which is a whole different thing. But anyway, they came out a few years ago with this book called Post-Border City, and it tried to explain how the border has basically been expanded. It's no longer just its physical demarcation, but the border has actually moved, and what Michael Deere calls the portable border, la frontera portátil. And for him, the border extends from LA all the way down to Baja, in this huge region of what he calls Baja Alta in this area. So it is a very interesting view of, you might say, postmodern urbanism, a little bit of the LA school of urbanism, Ed Soja and such, and also a very interesting idea of theories of hybridization, mostly known by, or mostly written by Ernesto Garcia Canclini, who is an Argentinian sociologist, who basically wrote the book on hybrid cultures in relationship to Latin America. So for Deere, the hybrid city, the post-border city, is part of the typologies of the 21st century, according to his book. So I kind of subscribed a little bit to that because I lived there. I lived there all my life. I've crossed the border most of my life. The other day we calculated that I've spent 3 years of my life waiting in line to cross the border. So I've been crossing the border since I was going to grade school. So it is a very interesting place, and it is a very hybrid place. So this is what part of our idea of what the border is in relationship to some of the projects that we do. But the other one is a totally opposed ideology or concept of the border, which is the transporter fallacy. This is a work by a geographer. His name is Tito Alegría, who's a Peruvian geographer who works for the federal government think tank in Tijuana. And he says that a transborder region is non-existent. So everything that Michael Deere says, he just does not believe. He doesn't, I mean, Tito is much more of an urban economist, and interestingly enough, Tito is a student of Michael Deere at USC. But he says that there are some very interesting structural differences between the two sides of the border. There's differentiating problems in praxis and planning. Binational planning agencies do not exist. Urban problems are not related, except ecological issues. So that's kind of the only way you might be you might enter into the discussion of some kind of binational region. Goods and services are produced in certain areas of the region, but not consumed by all inhabitants. Goods participate in two systems of relative pricing, and that's why it exists. So he's talking about differences. He's talking about that the border is actually made out of or lives from these differences. So differences in pricings of goods. For instance, if you don't have dental care in San Diego and need to go to the dentist, well, you go down to Tijuana and you can take care of the problem for $50, right? Instead of, so it's the same services, different pricing of the services, and these differences is what makes this region actually survive and become what it is. So goods participate in two systems of relative pricing. And there's international limitations. In Tijuana, only 50% of its inhabitants can legally cross the border. And it's interesting because it's supposed to be the most crossed border in the world with 60 million crosses a year. So there is this kind of paradoxical effect of sort of this concept that it's not this hybridized idea that Michael Deere has. Tito is much more of a structural sort of economist, saying that no, it's the differences that make this place interesting. So we navigate within those two definitions in our work. I mean, there are more, of course, there are more other concepts of the border, and I don't want to bore you with kind of those concepts for now, but I think these are the two main ones that still go around and are still very much talked about within architecture, urbanism, the arts, social studies, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we look at the border? And I try to do this little very simple matrix of how we work, and it's also like a table, like a preface, like a little table of context for what I'm going to show you today. There has been some subjects that we were interested in, at least in my firm, but I confuse the firm with the teaching because they're sometimes they're the same thing. So I really wouldn't teach if it wasn't, if it wouldn't let me do what I like to do. And so far so good. We've been looking, of course, at the hybrid city. That was the first sort of ideas that we were looking at back when we started in the year 2000. The whole kind of hybrid concept was really strong in the 1990s, mid-1990s with, there were some very, very important, almost biennale-like events. There was one called Insight, which was very important. They brought a lot of artists from all over the world to work on themes about the border. So the whole concept of hybridity was really strong, and we started out with those. And they had to do a lot with social-cultural programs. We did a lot of work with artists, and of course the topic was always kind of the border. Then we moved to a little other things like sustainability and the idea of resilient cities. We looked at ecological systems, and they also became sort of out of a binational character because it dealt with the Tijuana River watershed that straddles both sides of the border. So we did some work on those kind of ideas with students. The infrastructure city, the neo-industrial part of the work, like Todd was saying, Tijuana is a manufacturing town, and it manufactures electronics. It actually, everything from textiles to equipment for NASA, and also does biomedical equipment. So any television that's from Panasonic or Samsung that is 40 inches and above, it was, or bigger, I'm sorry, it was probably assembled in Tijuana. It used to be the TV capital of the world, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a new push for this neo-industrialization of the place, and so we looked at it as a kind of what will it do in the future for its economy, et cetera. And then the kind of the techno city, which is something that we recently were thinking about, and we're thinking about science fiction at the border. Like a little bit like Todd said, that we got a little bit tired of trying to fix problems, and we decided to, at the end, now kind of look at much more speculative projects. And there's a very interesting history about science fiction in Mexico, which is a genre that is fairly new, because kind of in the 20th century, magical realism kind of took over literature in Mexico, and science fiction was class B. It was for just these, few nerds that like that stuff. And but most of the science fiction written in Mexico comes from the border, which is interesting. So we were looking at that, and that has really, the science fiction in Mexico is different than in America. The American science fiction is very scientific. Science fiction in Mexico is very political. So we were looking at things of, the science fiction can narrate, or can we think about a path to different sovereignties at the border, et cetera, et cetera. So those are kind of the things that we might look at today. So the parallax, an apparent change in the position of an object resulting from a change in the position of the observer. So I'm in kind of that sort of situation where now I'm looking at this work from the other side. This is the first time I ever do it, well, except when I was in London, but I really didn't know much about Tijuana when I was there. This is when I came back from London that I realized that what am I going to do with all this knowledge that I had in London when I'm going from a developing country to a country still in development. The instruments were very different, so I had to think about a way to work that was different. By the way, these are pictures of the Trump's Wall when it was being built. We finally built these prototypes, and then they realized they didn't work and were being destroyed. And these were right across the border from the city of Tijuana in Otay Mesa. And I probably took 20 or 30 people from all over the world to go see them, journalists. I have become kind of the tour guide of the city some way or another, but it's been interesting where they put them. You could just go see them. It was like going to a theme park. of this craziness. So I'm going to start with something very practical and down to earth. In our office, we decided to be part of this organization called Esperanza de Mexico, or Fundación Esperanza de Mexico, Foundation, Mexican Hope Foundation, you might call it. And we did a lot of work for them pro bono. We were at the board. When we say we, is my wife and I, who's an architect as well. And this was a very, very interesting time for us. We've been with this organization for 10 years. And it's just going there and really doing what a lot of people talk about doing in Tijuana. You hear a lot of architects who go down there and they produce these beautiful drawings and they produce these beautiful projects for social housing, but they end up in a museum somewhere in the United States, and you go to Tijuana, you never see them. So we didn't want to do that. We actually didn't want to go and really do the real job and see how these organizations work. Esperanza is a foundation that does housing for very, very low-income people. They've been around since the 1980s, and they work with people who already have a piece of property but have never had enough money or made enough money to build a decent human, decent house for them. So it's very difficult because, like it says here, having property title appears not to change the financial patterns of families very much. So even if you have a title, like you could do somewhere in the United States, where you could probably go to a bank to get some money to build, here really it doesn't work that way. You have to put a lot of money up front in order to get a construction loan. These people don't have that. So what happens is that these properties in these areas are really close to the city. They're not in the periphery, really. And so we are kind of trying to also work with families and not just individuals, and try to build with a system of, a self-system of building. Right? Now, the government tried to work this out in the 1990s by building housing. By building houses, fixing housing by building houses. And they built these huge tracts of housing with basically no planning, no schools, no shops, et cetera. In the periphery, they didn't work out. By 2016, there were approximately 124,000 inhabited low-income housing units in Tijuana. So people went back to the communities where they already had social ties, where they already had family who would help them with their kids, where the schools were better, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a problem of abandonment right now of these very small 340 square foot houses that were built by the government. Actually, they were subsidized by the government, but they were built by private developers. So the market does not do well when you let them take over social housing, like Patrick Schumacher says that could happen, but it really, he should go to Tijuana and look at this stuff. So what's the mission? To promote the development of low-income communities interested in, improving their quality of life. That's what it is, and empower individuals. So this is the mission of the organization. We're fine, we work with that. And it's basically this. It's a house and saving funds where the families put in some money and they start saving for their new house. They participate in building their own house. We bring in volunteers from all over the world to help build the house. And the only thing they have to do is sort of be part of some of our environmental care programs. So this is non-political, non-religious. It's practically just trying to help these communities come together as one. We don't give out any of the housing. They pay it all off in 5 to 10 years or less. And it's incremental housing. They actually build one unit and then build the second unit, et cetera. So you'll see here, this is one of the units. It's all concrete block. We have a system of blocks that interlock, almost like a Lego that doesn't use mortar. And this way people can actually help build it. You don't need to have any skills to actually lay out block. It makes it easier for people to participate. And it's a slow house. A lot of the communities that people who work and work with us in this program are women. Most of them, a lot of them work in the manufacturing. In Tijuana, 50% of the labor force in the manufacturing plants are women. The reason it's really interesting, if you talk to a Korean or a Chinese manufacturing plant manager, they say because they have small hands and they're able to produce stuff really quickly. And so they hire mostly women to do that. So they are the ones that are making the money, and they're the ones putting in the money every week and also trying to be able to build these houses. This is just some images of these units that are being built in different parts of the city. What did we do? We started doing some prototypes of these houses. We started to see that these houses were not only boxes, but they could actually have some properties that will help them include passive cooling, that would be able to make them have better light, et cetera, et cetera. So we started to help that foundation with these kind of technical ideas for the houses. And now we're working with them to see, we start 3D printing some of these houses with a company from Holland called the BAM Group, B-A-M Group. Some of these houses end up becoming mansions. From living in a little shack of wood, they continue in the program and then they keep adding and adding. So it is an additive process. And we learned this has been going on around Latin America for a long time. If you look at Previ, for instance, in Peru, I don't know if you know about Previ, done in the 1960s, which was a huge project about incremental housing with designs by Christopher Alexander, James Sterling, and that was it's kind of that same model that we're using. So it's kind of like Alejandro Saera Polo kind of did not kind of invent the incremental housing thing. He actually, I think Previ was the first one to actually try to create that kind of community and that kind of system in Latin America. So we're kind of following the same idea. Different types of family units. And the government gave the foundation a piece of property, so we're now working on developing that small community of 70-some houses. The master plan was done by the city, and so we want to do is sort of design 3 or 4 prototypes that can be printed, and therefore start to build these houses in this community. And our office also designed a small community center for that site. So these are projects that we've done in the office that are, again, they're pro bono, but it's because there isn't. It would be very difficult for the foundation to actually come up with an architectural fee. So we started, doing some small models of how these houses would eventually be done and how they would grow in time, because they wouldn't be able to build them completely. So again, it's incremental. So it's kind of a slow process. 3D printing technology and all these sort of technologies are about being very fast, about putting things up together very fast, but we need a kind of slower house in order to accommodate not only the economies of the families, but also to accommodate the volunteers who come. So we need the process to be a little bit slower, which is sometimes these companies don't understand what I'm trying to say, but it is because of the way we're trying to build these communities. So these are some volunteers come from all over the world. These are some executives that were working on this house. They gave a lot of money to the foundation and they wanted to build this house in 2 days. And of course we said, yes, we can do that. And they gave all the money for the house. But once they told us they wanted to come to Esperanza to work for a house, that was a few months before the date. We started that day, so it took us 2 months working so that when they would come, we could finish the house in 2 days. And we stayed working in the site 24 hours. They would come in the morning, leave in the afternoon, come back in the morning. And during that lapse of time, we would stay at night and work and make sure that they would have something to do, you know, do some painting or try to help build the roof. But we ended up doing this house. Among some of the participants was Felipe Calderon, who was president of Mexico that time. Well, he just kind of was out of office. So it was a very important team of people that come in and out. I think there's even been some students from Ohio, probably high school students that have come down to help build houses. So this is the house they built. This is the house where they lived. And the small little house. I mean, these are not, of course, these are not great designs. They're actually just houses. I mean, if you look at the conditions and how they would live, which is with trash, the house was made with trash. The first one, they actually now have a concrete block house with insulation, with you know, electricity that works, water, et cetera, et cetera. So it is a much more humble way of living, and I think that's what we were going towards. And some of these projects are also work with the families in order to see what their necessities are. So that's what we did. And so here's, for that one, here's this family of working class family who basically changed their lives for the kids who were working there. So this is we're still working with the foundation. We're trying to get some automated construction, maybe kit of parts, maybe 3D print the whole house. We're talking about how to use technology in a way that does not sort of kick out or move out the human component of building this. Right, going back to a little bit of what the office did in 2005, like Todd was saying, you know, we're a small firm in Tijuana, we got nothing to do, and no, it's not true. We had a lot to do, but I was working with a friend, Fiamma Montezemolo, who's an anthropologist. She was in Tijuana doing cultural research. She's a cultural anthropologist. She was working for a think tank. And then my friend Heriberto Yépez is a writer. He's very critical sort of philosopher. And we got together thinking about that Fiamma wanted to do a project on the arts in the city. Heriberto wanted to do a book on poetry of the border, and I wanted to document the city, you know, kind of this urban, this informal urbanism of the city. So we got together and said, why not? We'll do it together. We'll put it together, but we're not going to write anything, just the introduction. So we decided, okay, sure, there are no more manifestos about cities, I think. I would consider maybe Rem's generic city as one of the last ones. And then we said, okay, let the city talk about itself. So we spent 2 years reading newspapers, theses, reading everything that was said about the city, that the city talked about in different media. And then we made a call for photographer or for photographs, for friends, for photographers. And we compiled all this information and put the book together with the text and the photographs. And sometimes the photographs would rely on the text and vice versa, but sometimes the text and the photographs would not coincide. And that was the idea. The idea that was that the self was kind of auto-representing its, itself. The city was talking about itself, and we were just the medium through which it did that. It's not a historical book. It's only about the condition of the city at the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century. So we kind of placed it around these books that we were looking at during that time, that came out during that time and talked about the cities in a very similar way. I think Tom Main's LA Now is kind of similar to what we were doing. Fernando Romero then did his hyperborder as well. So we were trying to kind of fit into that sort of segment of literature about cities, and was published by Black Dog in London, which unfortunately I think they closed. But they really did. We did the book in two languages, in Spanish and English, and so we had a good source of money to do it. So it had three parts: avatars, the first chapter, which talked about all the social, cultural aspects of the city. We had the second chapter was desires, that dealt with some cultural aspects and dealt with issues of religion, but also prostitution and all these other real places of the real Tijuana, right? And then the last part was permutations, which is really about kind of the urban form. And so that was sort of the three parts of the book. And again, it was just a series of images that looked like this. So you had image, you had text, you had statistics, you had all kinds of things. At the end, it's the reader who would need to come up with his own idea of what the city was about. It was a pretty open book. And so we kind of like that about this project. I think we're due to make another one because a lot of things have changed since we did this. So right about that time, we were thinking about the hybrid city. This picture is La Mona. La Mona is, I don't know, the doll, right? And it's in a community by the airport, so it's really close to the border, and it's in a canyon, and it's by a sculptor in Tijuana who actually built it to live in and to work in. So his studio is in the head. His living room is in the chest, and there's a small kitchen in the stomach, and then he goes in through the back, right? And so he lived there for a long time, and it became kind of Tijuana's Statue of Liberty, some way or another. And she's always naked, and it's been around for a long time. And it first of all, nobody liked it. Everybody thought it was, first of all, because it was a very, very low-income neighborhood. But now people have adopted it. It's now in the city's, it's part of the city's image. You'll see it in postcards and everything. So it's interesting how these things get appropriated in the urban realm by the city. So we were looking at these conditions in the office. Speaking of artists, during that time I had the opportunity to work on two projects that were extremely, extremely, for me, important. The one on the right, when I came back from London, I worked on the Getty with Robert Irwin, with the artist. I worked on the garden for the whole year, just cranking out steel detailing for the project, and being around Bob was amazing. You know, very strong character, very great teacher of art, et cetera, et cetera. I learned a lot from him, and plus that was my also learned some concepts of landscape architecture when I was there. And the other project is a project that I collaborated with the artist Íñigo Manglano. Manglano came to, he's from Chicago, you might know him, and Manglano came to Tijuana and he built this, this piece in the bull ring that's next to the border as what we called it is a radio telescope. Of course, it didn't work as a radio telescope, but it was called Searching for the Alien. And so it was next to the border, so I had to play on that. And Manglano had put all these recording systems on the side and would have people come in and wear headphones and say, look, you're listening at the cosmos. This is what the telescope is receiving, this radio telescope. But he was, of course, pre-recorded music, and a lot of people thought they were really listening to the heavens with this. But anyway, it was fun to work with him on this. Also learned a lot with Íñigo, became good friends. I haven't seen him for a while, but I mean, these experiences for me were also very interesting because then I kind of learned a little to not be so serious about you know, some of the work, especially in Tijuana, where you have to sometimes just you know, take it with a grain of salt. Of course, the border is always a very important aspect of life there. Not only for people who are trying to cross the border, of course, but also for regular citizens. Part of life is monitoring the border, part of our life. It's like monitoring snow here, I would guess. You know, it's like, how many cars are there? I mean, can we cross now? Or when is the best time to cross? And it's every day the same thing. So it's always part of our, you know, our concept of the city. And the border comes in many ways, in many different styles and shapes, and around the border there are many different events that happen. So it's not just one single line of metal, but it's actually places of events as you move through the city, which is really interesting. This is a border that was, this fence was put up during the W. Bush administration, and these are landing pads from the Gulf War. And they brought them and they took the chain link fence out and they put these mats in there. The only thing, I believe they put them backwards because they act as ladders. So people were actually able to climb them easier than, so, but it was the Bush administration, so, you know, they still can't get it right. Anyway, on the other images are of the families who are separated because of the fence. Some family members were able to cross the border and still don't have a legal migratory sort of condition. And so the other part of the family comes to the border area from very far from Mexico, and they meet in this area and they stay there and they have picnics for days, just meeting each other and eating, etc. And that's the only way they could see each other, because, you know, both sides cannot cross. So these are really interesting sort of events of how this, you know, this fence sort of works down there. We did a project for this is 2002 or 2001. We did a project for the Tijuana Cultural Center and Extension. The Tijuana Cultural Center is not there. You'll see us behind the trees, but it was done in the early 80s. It was done by an architect, Pedro Ramirez Vázquez from Mexico. If you go to Mexico City, you go see a lot of the huge government buildings, or you go to the Estadio Azteca, which is the biggest soccer stadium in Latin America. He did a lot of the big modernist buildings, especially the institutional ones, made out of concrete, very brutalist kind of projects. And in the mid-70s, late 80s, he built the Tijuana Cultural Center. We think about it was like, because Tijuana wasn't Mexican enough, we had to bring this architect from Mexico and sort of produces institutional architecture. And so our idea was that we wanted to produce a different effect, and we wanted to think about the porosity of the fence. We wanted to think about another way of portraying the project. And so we built this, we designed this museum around or inside this sort of lattice kind of fencing that you would see at the border or that you would see in people's houses. And so it became something familiar. But it had also that connotation of transparency, porosity, etc. Of course, we didn't win. But this is one of the projects that keeps on giving. So we later, we were invited by the San Diego Museum of Art to do an exhibition, to work on a space for an exhibition on Tijuana art with Tijuana artists. More than 20 artists participated, and they gave us the space that the other artists did not want. It was a space that had a lot of windows, so you can hang art or you can put stuff. So they gave us that corner, and we thought there was a great place to put a piece that had to do with the competition. So we built this, this piece out of laser cut bridge panels that mimic the effects of the competition project. It really did not have any program. The only program was as you move around, what's its porosity, because there were certain different levels of porosity of the panels. And then sometimes you were able to peek and look outside through the window through these voids. So it really worked out, the windows really worked out for us for this project. And it was, just the whole thing was made out of birch plywood. Then we were invited to the Children's Museum in San Diego to do another piece. We did a bigger one. This was a children's small little improv theater. So the children would kind of put on costumes and they would act out little plays. And we also got a big window. The building was designed by Rob Quigley and had this huge south window that would actually get in a lot of sun. And we loved that because then the patterns would actually play around all day. They would be different. So it was also theater-like in that sense that the piece participated throughout the day in how it kind of interacted with the space. And this was a much bigger piece that we did that, but it came from that idea of the competition as well. So we had some really nice pictures of that, and some really nice kind of we call them the cathedral shots, and so that worked. And then we did another one in Santa Monica, and we recycled these things as much as we could to eventually, they wouldn't work anymore, and we stopped the project there. Oh, yeah, this nice picture of somebody getting married there. So the museum sent us this picture. Hey, somebody liked it so much they decided to get married there. So it's no longer there. It wasn't a permanent piece. It was only there for 2 years or 3 years, I think. So we were really happy that people liked it so much that they decided to do this. Thinking about hybrids, we were also looking at hybrids. Well, the famous John Fenton Hybrid Buildings Pamphlet Architecture number 11 was a kind of case study for us, looking at hybrids in the city of Tijuana, where you have these constructions that are built by traditional construction systems, and then you have this house that is brought from San Diego, and it's put up on top of this block, of this concrete block sort of structure, and then you have a house. And then also looking at some of these, let's say, this is from the Insight program, the Border Arts program. This is a piece by Ruben Ortiz Torres called Alien Toy, Unidentified Cruising Object, which is a Border Patrol car made into a lowrider that sort of has pneumatics, and it sort of starts to shake and dance. And so he hybridizes the lowrider car, which is a symbol of protest for Chicanos in LA, with sort of, again, the Border Patrol car that runs across the border. We decided to look at those systems, look at some typologies, and build. This was a real project. We had a real client. We built. We were going to build this this building. This was in 2002 or 3, that had 5 stories. It had 10 units, and each unit had these pods. These pods, we were going to build them off-site, and then eventually crane them up and put them up there. And while the building was being built in a traditional way, sort of mimicking this kind of hybrid way of building of the city, and decided to, the building would end up looking like that. But the building didn't happen. The client was a real interesting story, because the client went to India, and he later came back and said, "I'm going to pay the project, but I'm not going to do it because I'm going to build a Krishnamurti center." So there's a Krishnamurti center now there on that site. So you would, yeah, that's what happened. Anyway, looking at the idea of the city again, the resilient city, and I'm not going to go a lot into the project. I want you to see how we start to work within this context. The other part is these besides here's Tijuana, we also worked on the republication of this report made by Kevin Lynch and Donald Appleyard in 1974, where they came to San Diego, paid $10,000 by the city of San Diego to do a future report of where to take the city in regards to a more sustainable planning, with more sustainable planning practices. What's interesting is that they got on a helicopter and started basically doing reviewing and looking at the city. And they got close to the border and realized that, Tijuana was an integral part, at least of the landscape, but also they realized later that it was an integral part of the economy of both places. And so what's important about, in summary, what's important about this document, it's one of the first documents that talks about binational planning at the border between these two border cities. And in 2016, with the elections, we thought that it was important to bring it back. We thought that it was important to publish it again, have some comments, some new essays, and talk about, instead of walls, talk about environmental planning, about urban planning, et cetera, et cetera. And so we reprinted this with the Mexican think tank, San Diego State University, and other organizations. And yes, there's a book of that here. It's a beautiful book. These are sketches by Donald Appleyard, who was a landscape architect, probably made with photographs that they took on the helicopter. This is one of them. This is one of the images of the border, where they're talking about how certain, let's say, institutions could work on both sides, et cetera, et cetera. It's worth looking at it. The drawings are really amazing. How am I doing on time? All right. Based on those sort of ideas of watersheds, environmental planning, resilient, et cetera, we did some work with WashU on canyon development, and some research on part of the river system in the city. Tijuana has a channelized river like LA, and of course it has a lot of problems with housing, which at the end people end up living in the different areas which are still natural, but people come in and inhabit them. This is the manufacturing plants also dump a lot of stuff into the only rivers that are left. Developers built next to the river. So it is, I mean, these cases are really, really interesting. But these cases you see a lot in Latin America. You see the manufacturing, you see the poverty, the dirt, and you say, so how do you work with this stuff? And WashU was interested in they did a studio for 3 years. They came here 3 years and worked these projects. And so we tried to do some environmental planning, do some much more, let's say, softer channelization of the river, reprogramming the sort of the landscape to also have a program and a function so that it was much not only it was also productive in one way or another. So this is some of the images. This is only one of many, but this is kind of the scale that we were looking at. We did 2 sides. The other side was next to the ocean. On the north side, there's the estuary, a protected wetland. On the other sides, there's 40,000 people living on that canyon, and all the water that, when it rains, all the water that comes from the canyon ends up in the estuary, pollutes the California beaches, and then you have a binational problem. So we were working with these guys on how to build this resilient sort of areas, catchments, area catchments with pools, and how do you make this catchment when it doesn't rain? What happens in these areas? They become hybridized because they are part of other activities that the community can have, et cetera, et cetera. So students learn that nobody's going to go anywhere. They're going to stay there. How do we work with how people live there, and how do we do that? So we worked on that for a while. These are some of the master plans that they did, which was, we won an award for it, a ULI award, I think, for one of these projects, an Urban Land Institute award, sustainable practices, something like that. This was interesting. This was a very, I don't know, maybe it's something from the AA back there when we used to didn't know what to do, and I remember that Jeff would say, just put something on there, and so we were looking at the canal and said, what are we going to do with this canal? It's horrible, it smells bad, the water that goes through there, and there's a lot of people living in the canal, which makes it a problem. And I said, let's just fill it up with solar panels. And we drew this very simple Photoshop image of what it would look like if the whole thing was covered in solar panels. And we got so much press just for that, just as that one image. So we were in the LA Times, Fox News, a lot of papers in Mexico that I was trying to change. And the Tijuana River, and they were saying, would it work for LA? Gary wasn't working on the LA River yet, but it's so interesting how this very simple idea just ended up becoming a project that when a mayoral candidate kind of took it over and said, if I win, we'll build it. Of course, he didn't win, but it was a project that we did. At the end, we started to do some research on what was the capacities of and the challenges of doing this, and why we wanted to do it, how we could do it, what would it do for the city, what other systems could be implemented to clean the water that goes through there. We were looking at algae systems. So it was, again, not throwing out or creating this oasis like LA wants to do with its river, but it's actually just making the infrastructure perform better and sort of hybridizing it into a solar farm. That's basically what we did. And so we did some other images, very simple images of what it would look like. Maybe it had some bikeways and people can, go ride through that. There was the algae raceways, et cetera, et cetera. So it started to become an interesting project for the city where they were taking it seriously. And we calculated that it would be a 95 megawatt farm it would be the biggest farm in Mexico, biggest solar farm in Mexico if it happened. So it was really interesting, and it's still out there in people's mind, but we haven't worked on it for a while. And we continue with these kind of these utopic ideas. We won a competition for a Hyperloop route, Hyperloop 1, Virgin Hyperloop, which is now called, set out a competition around the world where they asked people where were the best routes would happen, or how would they change your region if you had a Hyperloop system. And we proposed number 5, Hyperloop West, which was a cross-border Hyperloop from the port of Ensenada to the port of LA. The port of Ensenada is probably 2 hours from Tijuana, going through the city of Tijuana, picking up manufacturing goods and taking them to the port of Long Beach, and from there distribute them to the rest of the US. So we did the project. It was really not designing it as an architectural project, but it was designing the system and putting out the numbers, making sure they worked out. But in the meantime, Hyperloop 1 was doing their test track in Nevada, and out of, I don't know, maybe 3,000 entries, we were semifinalists of the 10 most, let's say, probable routes for the country here in the U.S. And so it was this route. It was from LA, Ensenada. It was interesting because this was also 2016. We went to Washington, D.C. to present this project, and they told us, you got to take the Tijuana part out. Because, so Trump had just won, and they said, if he looks at we're doing a cross-border thing, this way and not that way, he's not, he's not gonna like it. So we took that out, and then we said, okay, that's the second phase, and it will happen later. But we looked at the advantages of having it where people could live if they wanted to, because you would be able to go from LA to Ensenada, which takes about 4 hours in about 18 minutes, according to the system. So this is a project we're still working on. We're working now with Hyperloop Transportation Technologies, which is the second company working on the technology. Their test track is in Toulouse, in France, and my students here at Oklahoma are doing a hypothetical station in Oklahoma City, which we'll go to present in March to Hyperloop. So it's an interesting part. But we know that the Hyperloop guys, these companies are just a bunch of engineers, and a lot of them have not even thought what the impact of these technologies would be on the urban realm, especially in developing countries, right? So we teamed up for this. There was an exhibition in San Diego that was curated by Rebecca Webb, who is Michael Webb's daughter from Archigram. And she said, look, I'm gonna do an exhibition on transportation, and my dad's gonna be in it, you're gonna be in it? And of course we said, yes, we wanna be next to, Michael Webb. And so I teamed up with a friend of mine who is two friends of mine, another architect and who's an illustrator, Charles Globitz, and we built a little story about Hyperloop, about this man who goes from the center of Mexico to Tijuana and tries to get on the Hyperloop to go visit his grandma in LA. And which is the story of the migration story of forever, what happens. And so the idea was that we were critiquing Hyperloop in the way that this guy had to go, didn't know what the Hyperloop was, how was he gonna get into it, how was he gonna pay for it because it was paid in cryptocurrency. He had to go to these guys in Tijuana who would sell him this currency, but it was like buying illegal drugs, and eventually he made it and visits his grandma, because his grandma's not even alive. He was just taking her an upgrade for her little pod where she now lives. And so we were just kind of having fun with this idea about, and sort of criticizing a little bit Hyperloop, and saying, look, you have to understand what's the impacts, what are the urban impacts that you're gonna have in the future? Not only, don't you think this is just gonna be a generic system that's gonna work everywhere the same way? So these turned out really, really great. And we plan to do a lot more of these kinds of projects together. Almost done. I was the curator for the Tijuana San Diego little pavilion in Seoul in 2017 for the Seoul Biennale. We put together a lot of these ideas that I talked to you about right now, which are ideas about landscape, ideas about the economies between the border, a lot of sort of the urban form, and also the aspects of both sides of the border. The Koreans were really interested. They told me, can you tell us, or can you show us, how does a working border, how does a border that is in peace work? And because we think one day, we're going to have a border like that, and so I said, well, okay. I mean, this is how it kind of works. It's at the beginning, like I said, it works. Some things are relatively, pretty much the same, and others are very different, and that's what makes this place interesting. So we did this exhibition in Seoul, in the in the Saha building. I think that's where it was. And to finish is we do architecture. We just finished this house in Tijuana. Again, it was a hard site. This was for just a woman who's from France. Sorry about the images. She's a demographer. She's a scientist, and she bought this really beautiful property slope with great views of Tijuana, but she wanted a house in one floor. So we tried that. And so at the end, what we did is kind of created a little plinth and then put the house on top of that plinth, and created a courtyard house, basically, which is good for the site. And the reason we did the courtyard house is because there's so many buildings going up now around her site that she's not going to get any sort of good ventilation or sunlight in the future, because she's going to be surrounded by these tall apartment buildings. So we decided to kind of create her own little environment within this building. And so this is the elevation. Basically, you go up to the courtyard and you enter the house to the courtyard, and the whole house is on that level. I mean, if you continue to go up, there's a roof garden. There's a green roof garden that she also wanted, but the whole house is in one level. And so this is the house when it was recently finished. This is where you come up and you go up to this courtyard. There's a huge tree now in here, and the whole house is just basically works around this courtyard. There's the living room, and then there's the kitchen, and there's the bedrooms over here. So it kind of works with it's facing east, and it has some interesting, very simple house. It's all white concrete. And concrete floors, etc. We were working with this trying to work with this transparency that you were in the back of the house, you could actually see through all the layers and see through all the way to the front. And so that's what we tried to do with these pictures. This is her bedroom, which has a corner window. So that's the only thing that she wanted in front of the house. And of course, she is a demographer, a scientist, and she always has parties with her fellow scientists. And she wanted a really nice, huge balcony in front of the house looking at the city. And we had a lot of issues with that, because then we wouldn't have any facade. And so how do you make a balcony disappear? And that's what was really difficult for us to do. Not disappear, but how do you have a facade? Not just a balcony. So we tried to play around with some of the forms there, or the forms, so that the balcony at least looked like it was a kind of a void of something that was there, and not just the balcony. But it's a great space, and so yeah, we also work on some of these projects when we can. And well, anyway, I think that's my last slide. Thank you.